Hello and welcome to all the Hylians out there. I'm Joe, and today we have another Hyrule in Focus. At the time of this recording, Dan is off visiting family, so we're not able to do a continued analysis of A Link to the Past yet. But don't worry, that's coming. That hopefully next week we'll be able to do that. But for now, let's get down to talking about a topic that has kind of fascinated me for a while, and it's one that, if I'm being honest, is something I'm going to divide into multiple parts, as there's a lot to discuss regarding Navy, the Skull Kids fairies, and the Great Fairies in general, as they're a source of great fascination to me. To start with, I've got a lot of questions about these fairies. To start with, where do they come from? We're not given much explanation for them. It's this sort of thing that I find really interesting, but also frustrating, if I'm being honest. The main fairies that we've seen in various media range from Sprite to Navy to the two in Majora's Mask to the Great Fairies. But the fairies I'm focusing on here are the smaller ones like Navy. The first major character who's a fairy was Navy, of course, as she plays a large role. I'm not counting the cartoon. I'm just talking about it in the games, the main medium through which Zelda games are, their stories are conveyed. It seems that at the beginning of Ocarina of Time, every Kokiri child has a fairy. This leads to Malon, for example, nicknaming Link Fairy Boy. Link is the only Kokiri, so to speak, without a fairy, but in reality, he's not really a Kokiri, he's a Hylian. The Kokiri seem to be eternal children, and given that they don't seem to have much in the way of awareness, that is to say, the thing about the Kokiri seems that they're essentially children. They're akin to the Peter Pan lost boys and whatnot. This leads to them being trapped in the form of children and being fairly innocent about the outside world, which is why they are such easy prey for Ganon and his monsters. Navy and the other fairies seem to serve as a kind of parental set of figures, with these fairies looking out for the Kokiri children and often doting on them, correcting them. I imagine looking out for them much more than vice versa. The fairies seem to be primarily servants of the Great Deku Tree, which kind of leads me to believe that they might have a link to Ferrari more than any other of the three golden goddesses. I do wonder if these fae have the same sort of weakness as in traditional Irish literature. That is to say, if you say you don't believe in them, it'll actually kill them. And while it's certainly true that Navy and Link are cast in similar roles as Tinkerbell and Peter Pan, the dynamic is enormously different, at least from most depictions of Peter Pan. It's known that it's the Great Deku Tree that seems to assign fae to a certain Kokiri. Each fairy has a different attitude, but all of them serve the Great Deku Tree unquestionably. He's more linked to Ferrari than he is to us mere mortals. If the fairies are more connected to Ferrari through the Great Deku Tree, this means that they're really not simply spirits of nature, but of courage, because Ferrari is the representative of courage itself. So the other conclusion I draw is that the Deku Tree assigns a certain fairy to a certain Kokiri based on the personality of the Kokiri and maybe even the fairy, as it seems that each of the fae have independent will, which means they're all individuals with their own personalities. The Great Deku Tree, in some ways, is the spirit of the forest, and this side of him is one that can be easily forgotten because people just think, oh yeah, Great Deku Tree, without really pondering what that exactly means, because it means he sustains the forest. And maybe the Kokiri Woods are essentially an extension of him, so that you get this forest that maybe grew around him rather than him from the forest. He's almost more like the spirit of the forest from Princess Mononoke. One should remember that in Japanese Shinto beliefs, trees and the forests and nature itself are very special. It's believed that everything has a spirit. In the case of Zelda, this would mean that each of the fairies is a otherworldly creature of sorts that is kind of beyond human understanding. What I wonder is, do they come with any other abilities? It doesn't seem like fairies are particularly fierce creatures. But then when you consider the great fairies, maybe there's a pecking order where a smaller fairy can become a great fairy, and you thus get a growth of sorts. So does that mean Navy might one day be a great fairy? I have a lot of questions about the fairies, not least of which is their metaphysical energy. I wonder if maybe they draw their essence to an extent from either the Great Deku Tree, Furore, or maybe the Triforce of Courage. Is that how it works? The only way to be sure would be if one was to permanently remove one of these three, which I can only think that would be a catastrophe of epic proportions. Important thing is that the fairies are there to support the Kokiri, and that it's a bond that is honestly fairly unquestionable in its depth and whatnot. But one question I have is there a deeper bond of sorts between Fairy and Kokiri, such as the possibility that they might share a metaphysical link to one another? So yeah, I've got a lot of questions about this sort of bond, and it's one that is fairly fascinating. For the bond between Navy and Link, Navy ends up helping Link with, in terms of gameplay, locking onto targets and whatnot, with her warning him of danger whenever she senses or spots it, which this demonstrates, for example, that Navy has a certain amount of courage about her that is rather uncommon considering how vulnerable she herself is. So while I know that the fans often criticize her, one has to kind of give her some kudos in terms of storyline and lore. Which brings me to the Kokiri now. They are a fascinating people, probably more Fae-like than the Hylians are, and rather more innocent, yes, as has been mentioned. But I think that one should perhaps consider the strong possibility that they are themselves in some way tied in terms of energy and essence to the very forest itself. They are an extension of it, an expression of it, I think. Or it's possible that they're rather like the wild elves to the high elves of D&D kind of stories and Tolkien stories, so that maybe they're rather pure forms of elves than the Hylians are in a way. Though I don't think it's as much of a mystery where the Kokiri come from. They obviously come from the Great Deku Tree, which would make him their father. But it's more the Kokiri bond with the fairy that fascinates me. I hope you all don't mind the semi-rambling video here and the pondering thing here. I'm thinking of doing a, as mentioned, Navy-focused video at some point, maybe after the next A Link to the Past video. And I'm thinking of finally doing what Dan wants, a review of Four Swords Misadventures, which I've not seen in years. So if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to smash that like and that subscribe button. As though you were Link taking down Volvagia.